What the West knows as the Vietnam War is known here as the Second Indochina War. The reason for this is because the conflict wasn't just about Vietnam, and it did not involve just Vietnam. In fact, it wasn't even a single conflict, but more like several conflicts happening at the same time. One such sub-conflict that took place during what the West calls the Vietnam War was the Cambodian Civil War, at the end of which Saloth Sar became the de facto dictator of Cambodia, which he renamed Democratic Kampuchea. Legally, the regime lasted for 4 years, but Phnom Penh had been under the communist terror for 2 years by the time the official recognition of the regime was published. By this time, Saloth Sar was already known under his chosen name, Pol Pot. The Pol Pot regime killed almost a third of the population of Cambodia through starvation, overwork, disease, and of course, mass executions. The aftermath of the regime left millions more in abject poverty for almost 2 generations, who continue to call this period today in Khmer as samai, or the era of the contemptible pot. A socialist utopia that was so terrifying that even the Soviet Union and the Vietnamese communists disagreed with it. In fact, the latter disagreed so much that after the American problem was solved, they made it a point to violently overthrow this regime. Still, a socialist utopia that was not terrifying enough for left-wing luminaries in the West. Gunnar Bergström needed over 30 years to figure it out that the utopia was a bad idea. And the Swedish communist is a happy example. Noam Chomsky, for instance, continues to this day to dispute the culpability of Pol Pot or of the regime more broadly. Stuck in whataboutism, Chomsky and the broader Westoid left completely missed the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia in which the members of the regime itself confirmed things that the Westoid left continues to deny to this day. So that's the topic for this episode, the era of the contemptible pot and the aftermath. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the 6th featured installment of the Khmer series. Alright, so since this is YouTube and this series is supported by our members, there is little to gain in going through the details anyone can read on Wikipedia or through several questions in one's favorite chatbot. What we'll be looking at instead is the part that is less easy to find discussions about. Now, unfortunately, in doing so, there is a risk that this video gets taken down, just like it happened with the video about the Pitești experiment, first blocked for its honest descriptions of what communists actually do, then blocked for imaginary hate, and then finally blocked through abusive copyright claims. We should expect something similar to happen to this video as well, and hopefully the Internet Archive will be just as generous. Now, the comparison with Pitești is not by accident. You are now looking at S21, one of the 189 known interrogation centers in Cambodia during the Pol Pot regime, and also the most notorious of them. It was said in the previous episode that most countries that have been through such a regime have either straight up denied its existence, like in China, or went to great lengths to preserve and embrace the memory of it. Cambodia somehow did both. It went further than most post-Soviet countries by actually having an international tribunal about the whole ordeal, but also making it very difficult to study it physically, although with a few fascinating exceptions. S21, now known as the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, is one of the few physical places you can study a facet of the Pol Pot regime, the carceral facet, to be more precise. I compared this place with the Pitești experiment because fundamentally the point was roughly the same, to get the inmates to renounce their identity, rat in their family and friends to the party, and to atone for being an enemy of the party. You see, if you were arrested, you were an enemy. The party never made mistakes. No, I'm serious, that's what they believed.
ឥឡូវចុះអាក្មេងទូចៗអាខ្លះអាយុមិនតាន់បានមួយឆ្នាំផងនៅ3នៅបើកដោះឡើយអាខ្លះទៅមិនចេះដើរអាហ្នឹងវាប្រឆាំងអីទេវាខ្មាំងមិនដែរហ្នឹងបាក់ទីស21បានណែនាំថាបើសិនជាបាក់ចាប់មកហើយគឺជាខ្មាំងមកបាក់ចាប់មកប្តីគឺប្រពន្ធក៏ត្រូវចាប់កូនត្រូវចាប់យកមកដែរសូម្បីតែម៉ែឪក៏ដោយបងប្អូនយើងក៏ដោយបើថាបាក់ចាប់មកគឺជាខ្មាំងមកបាក់គឺចែកដល់ឡៃពីគ្នាធំជាងគេមានតែអង្គការមានបាក់ហ្នឹងបើឲ្យយកទៅកំតិចយើងត្រូវយកទៅកំតិចអត់មានថាការគិតគូរអីតាតិចអត់ទេបាទព្រោះបាក់ស21ថាទៅចាប់មកមិនចេះខុសតែយកមកគឺខ្មាំងមកអញ្ចឹងអានេះអត្តសញ្ញាណដែលយើងថាពិចារណាយើងជាមនុស្សហ្នឹងវាបាត់បង់អស់លីងពេលហ្នឹងវាលែងមានការគិតណាម៉ែណាឪអស់វាលែងជឿម៉ែឪឯងអត់ហើយថ្ងៃហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងវាបំពាក់អំពន់វាមិនទេអញ្ចឹងបាទបើគេថាខ្មាំងអាហ្នឹងទៅតាមថាខ្មាំងអញ្ចឹង
This surreal dialogue is from the documentary S21, The Khmer Rouge Killing Machine, and the people in the documentary are very real. The man in the background in light green shirt was a guard here. The man asking the questions is a former prisoner here. The full documentary is available for our members. The film was made in 2003 when most of the leadership of the regime was still alive. In fact, the success of this documentary convinced some of the former regime people to cooperate with the Khmer Rouge Special Tribunal. Like this guy, Kheo Samphan, who was number 3 or number 4 in the regime. For decades, he denied S21 ever existed. This documentary moved him enough to start talking. He is the last senior member of the Pol Pot regime that is still alive. At age 94, he is also the oldest inmate in the modern Cambodian prison system, serving 2 consecutive life sentences for genocide and crimes against humanity. The comparison with Pitești goes even further. Some of the guards were also former inmates who have been, quote, re-educated, unquote. And the methods weren't particularly different from what the communists had applied in Romania 25 years prior to the Khmer Rouge. For instance, these gallows weren't for executions. The point here wasn't killing, although, of course, deaths did occur. The point was torture, intelligence gathering, and re-education. So, for instance, the inmate would be tied by his hips and hung on these gallows upside down. When the inmate would pass out from the beatings, he would be lowered closer to these urns, which were filled with human feces. Human excrement was used during torture in the Soviet Gulag and the Romanian Gulag as well, but the Khmer Rouge took it to a new level. In fact, everything you can imagine as extremist thought patterns from a very far-left anarcho-primitivist movement, the Khmer Rouge likely tried it. So in May 1973, Pol Pot orders the collectivization of the villages in the territories that the Khmer Rouge was already controlling. This was the middle of the civil war between the communists and the legitimate government. With this move, the Khmer Rouge were not only starting their ideological project, which of course included the abolition of private property, but they also secured the resources necessary for them to actually win the war. Cambodia was at the time, and to a certain extent still is, fundamentally an agricultural country. Controlling the food supply was thus crucial. By depriving the government forces of food, it was only a matter of time until the communists would advance all the way here to the capital city. Of course, collectivization wasn't popular, but when you're willing to kill double-digit percentages of the country to build utopia, these things don't matter that much. Still, there was some resistance. The wealthiest farmers preferred to slaughter their livestock and burn everything before fleeing in order to deprive the communists from controlling it. Some 60,000 of them managed to flee, but most didn't and couldn't flee. So they ended up working for Pol Pot, for free. Even after Pol Pot won the civil war and the so-called democratic Kampuchea was established, most farmers continued to work for free. During the Civil War, Pol Pot had secured the printing of a new currency in China, but postponed its introduction even after coming to power for ideological reasons. So, a slave state. No, not metaphorically, but very much literally. Work the fields for free or you end up in the killing fields. More on that in a few minutes. Even before settling into power here in Phnom Penh, prisons like this one were already full. The Khmer Rouge soldiers who spent too much time in North Vietnam were also considered not loyal enough and were interned in places like this one starting from 1973. That's full 2 years before the establishment of the Communist Republic. Most of those people ended up in the killing fields as well. Most of their names aren't even known, and dead bodies from this period are still being discovered to this day. But the real tragedy started in 1974, when the Khmer Rouge decides that it will expel the urban populations, particularly Phnom Penh. You see, the Civil War saw a lot of displaced people who kept on fleeing southwards. A lot of them found refuge here in the capital city. So when the communists finally took the city in 1975, there was an hour of celebration, for the war had ended, and then the killings started. First, around 800 senior government, military and police figures. Although the president and the acting president managed to flee with the US Navy, the rest of the legitimate government were not so lucky. Then came the civilians. The Khmer Rouge already disliked the population of Phnom Penh. They viewed city dwellers with mistrust at best and contempt in the rest of the time. In their view, city dwellers were the engine of capitalism, and as such, the destruction of city dwellers was a necessary condition to abolishing capitalism. And they meant that literally. And they didn't have much sympathy for the rural people who had fled to Phnom Penh during the war either. They regarded those as traitors of the socialist order. The way the communists emptied the capital city was through a very common communist tool: lying. The new regime told the 2.5 million residents of Phnom Penh that the United States was going to bomb the city, so everyone not military or essential personnel had to leave immediately. Oh, and don't take much with you. You'll be permitted to return in 3 or 4 days. All of that was a lie. There was no bombing raid, American or otherwise, and nobody was allowed to return in 3 or 4 days, more like over 4 years later, when the regime was finally ousted. The evacuation took place in a form of a march, very much literally. Men, women, children, elderly, even bed-bound sick people from hospital. Everyone had to march out of the city. At least 15,000 people were physically removed from the city's hospitals and forced to march. And since the march took place in the hottest month of the year, it won't surprise you to learn that a minimum of 20,000 people died just along this route. But until making it out of the city, the people of Phnom Penh would be introduced to another common tool of the communists: stealing. The Khmer Rouge erected checkpoints along the roads out of the city. The most trustworthy comrades would search the marchers and remove most of their belongings. Now, with the city empty, the real nightmare could begin. Pol Pot established his government in a former bank, which he renames it the K1 building. The Khmer Rouge regime had a thing with naming places as a letter and a number, which also explains the name of this place. The reason horrors such as S21 could take place in the middle of the city is precisely because the city was empty. Very few people would even know this was happening. To give you an idea, this was the view from my hotel room. You can see the prison from my room. You can't get any more central location than this. But during Pol Pot, nobody lived here as everyone had been deported. And to give you an idea about just how secretive the whole thing was, the commander of the Tuol Gulag was this guy, Kangyek Yiru, better known as Comrade Dulc. Comrade Dulc, who ran this prison with an iron fist and kept very detailed records about everything here, would only report to this man, Nguyen Tien, better known as Brother Number 2. This man, for all intents and purposes, was even worse than Pol Pot himself. Pol Pot had crazy ideas, but the brutal implementation was with Brother Number 2, while the processing of the purges and the prisons was with Comrade Dulc. Brother Number 2 remained unrepentant throughout his trial and sentencing. He died in 2019 at age 93, serving 3 consecutive life sentences for crimes against humanity. Comrade Dulc died in 2020 at age 77, also in prison. For copyright reasons, I can't quote extensively from Brother Number 2, but I will leave in the description a long interview with this fella. And I'll mention something else. Without the extended confession and cooperation by Comrade Dulc, we probably wouldn't have found out a lot of things. Not only he confessed to executing over 12,000 prisoners from S21, but he brought his own archive, which was even more detailed than the one found here in the prison at the liberation by the Vietnamese. More on that later. And it's also thanks to him that we know about other things and other places, such as this place. Officially, a chemical substance storage facility. In reality, one of the many killing fields. And when we say killing fields, plural, it is meant very much literally. This place is one of the few one can visit because it's close to the capital city and because new dead bodies are still being found to this day in it. That's largely because the soil is more solid in this part of the country and also has fewer landmines and unexploded ordnances, which means it can be explored by the archaeologists. But throughout the country, nobody knows how many such places exist. The top leadership of the Khmer Rouge acknowledged the execution of at least 1.3 million people in such places, but even they had no idea how many killing fields are out there. And given the soil of Cambodia, we may never know. But what we do know for sure is that this was intentional. In the collective farms, dead bodies were officially considered fertilizer to make better rice for the party. I wish I were joking or exaggerating. In fact, it is very hard to exaggerate the madness of the Khmer Rouge regime. When I found out that the Khmer Rouge would bash children's heads against this tree to save up on ammo, I thought this had to be an exaggeration. And then I read in the long transcripts of the Khmer Rouge tribunal that there was an even official rationale for this, which was to, quote, stop them growing up and taking revenge for their parents' deaths, unquote. And when I say children, I mean very young children, under 5 years old, routinely under 1 year old. Older children, especially from 15 upwards, were re-educated and asked to decapitate traitors. Those who refused were accused of having a Vietnamese head and a Cambodian body and beheaded themselves as well. Again, it doesn't matter how many crazy things you can think of, the Khmer Rouge likely did far worse and on a wide scale. Kheo Samphan, whom we mentioned earlier as the one moved by the documentary, explained in the tribunal, quote, I have never wanted anything other than social justice, unquote. And he wasn't lying. This is the practical application of abolishing income inequality and introducing social justice. It always ends with murdered children. It's not that the Khmer Rouge that were particularly extremist. What's extremist is the idea that so many have in Europe today, that you can have social justice without state-sanctioned murder. And as these things were happening, the Harvard Review was publishing Noam Chomsky, who believed the Khmer Rouge was the victim of a, quote, vast and unprecedented propaganda campaign, unquote. It is important to keep this in mind as we wonder why there was no serious internal rebellion against the Khmer Rouge. Well, besides the cities being empty and the regime being both paranoid and genocidal, the potential support from the outside was limited as well. China was having its own problems, the Soviet Union wasn't interested, the US was stuck in Vietnam, and the intellectual elites in both Europe and the United States were in fact fond of this regime. Sure, not all, not always, yada yada yada, but the point remains. There weren't many takers onto the position that the Khmer Rouge is crazy. Oh, and of course, like any communist regime that respects itself, it was also hell-bent on abolishing religion. And like in many places in the world, some religious minorities are also ethnic minorities. But the Khmer Rouge was particularly mad at Muslims and Buddhist monks, which were considered ideas that stood in the way of progress. And by progress, they meant toiling the fields for free. Now, that's not to say others fared better. The Roman Catholic Cathedral of Phnom Penh was razed. All Christian clergy was executed in the first days of the regime, and Chinese graves were torn apart in a deliberate attempt at breaking religious bonds. The Muslims were forced to eat pork. Those who disagreed ended up being fertilizer, but not before they were forced into cannibalism. Again, I wish I were joking. The Khmer minority, which was majority Muslim, almost disappeared from Cambodia. Hundreds of thousands of people, almost the entire ethnic group. Muslims, and not just imams, but regular Muslims as well, alongside Buddhist and Christian clergy, ethnic Vietnamese, Chinese or Thai, as well as professionals and intellectuals, including almost everyone with an education and people who understood a foreign language, all of these were depositees. That is to say, people who axiomatically had no rights in the new regime. The other two categories were the full rights members and the candidates. As always with any communist regime, the full rights members were the poorest and the least educated. Very similar to the concept of healthy origin applied in communist Romania. The full rights members were entitled to full rations, could join the Communist Party, the army, or the leadership of the cooperative farms, which included the right to kill. The candidates were only allowed low-level administrative positions and were subjected to scrutiny as they were axiomatically under suspicion. In fact, most of the people purged in 1977 were part of this quasi-middle class. The entire society was quite literally turned upside down. Every aspect of it, from the language, now called Kampuchean instead of Khmer, and with newspeak as well, to social class, to the economy, to family relations, to how you spend your spare time, everything. The week now had 11 days, 10 days of labor and 1 day off. Loudspeakers were installed to broadcast the kind of propaganda I've shown at the beginning of this video. Now these had a double role, the obvious propaganda role, but they were also loud enough that they could cover up gunfire or screams. It's how Boer killing fields were identified in the 1980s and 1990s. If you found some abandoned tree loudspeaker, chances were pretty high that you would find a mass grave nearby. This was democratic Kampuchea, in top 5 closest places to hell on earth, competing with communist Albania, which we covered on the channel in 2017, 1990s North Korea, the Soviet Gulag, or National Socialist Germany. And here comes the most messed up part. The fall of the Khmer Rouge happened despite the world not wanting it to fall. This is one of those cases where nobody is the good guy, but the outcome is remarkably good. On Christmas Day in 1978, the Vietnamese army launches a full-scale invasion, and by January 1st, 1979, the main force had entered Cambodia and started slowly grinding the Khmer Rouge defenses. This was after months of raids by the Khmer Rouge into the Vietnamese territory. Pol Pot didn't want to conquer Vietnam, he just wanted to shore up his popularity by playing the nationalist card. He bet that the Cambodians' mistrust of the Vietnamese can be leveraged. Well, he was right, except it was leveraged against him, eventually. Of course, officially, now the Socialist Republic of Vietnam argues that it was a humanitarian intervention, an interpretation accepted by the modern Cambodian state as well, as evidenced by this monument of Khmer-Vietnamese friendship in the middle of Phnom Penh. But that's not how it was viewed then. At the time, it was viewed as Vietnamese aggression and occupation, to which everyone opposed. And by that, I mean everyone. China helped evacuate the core leadership and secured weapons and transport through Thailand to help the Khmer Rouge fight the invasion. The CCP was afraid that a stronger Vietnam would end up conquering most of Indochina, and that would have been bad because Vietnam was at the time Soviet-aligned. And this was, of course, after the Sino-Soviet split. In China, the Khmer Rouge set up their Voice of Democratic Kampuchea radio station, which encouraged guerrilla warfare and continued to broadcast all the way until 1998. In the end, this didn't turn out to be the case. The USSR was getting ready to invade Afghanistan, which it did on Christmas Day of 1979, and the Politburo at the time simply did not care whether Pol Pot or a Vietnamese puppet government runs Cambodia. Besides, the USSR was already considering being less annoying on the international stage in return to being allowed to try its own luck in Afghanistan. So the Soviet Union, alongside the United States and most of the non-socialist Asian countries, refused to recognize the Vietnamese occupation government, which was formed by Khmer Rouge, who had fled to Vietnam in order to avoid Pol Pot's mad purges. Among those who had fled, Mr. Hun Sen, that we discussed in the previous episode. Now, the United States was no big fan of Pol Pot either, but recognizing in 1979 that Vietnam might have had a point when the American clusterfuck in the region was still very much fresh in the minds of everyone, was just bad politics, both domestically and internationally, within what was then the Western Bloc. Point being that due to geopolitics, even though the Khmer Rouge nightmare ended in 1979, Cambodia would remain in a limbo for more than a decade. In this time, Pol Pot and the remaining comrades built a fortress on the border with Thailand, full of minefields and complex defenses. That part of the country is still difficult to access and impossible to develop to this day because not all of those landmines have been cleared. Pol Pot, brother number 1, died in April 1998 at age 73 in this last holdout. Then, and only then, the last Khmer Rouge surrendered. The fact that even in these circumstances there was still some modicum of justice is nothing short of remarkable. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia dissolved in 2022 after running out of people to prosecute, as they were all dead or in prison. It wasn't exactly the Nuremberg trials, but it was more than what the victims of other regimes got. There was no tribunal for the victims of the Gulag or a tribunal for the Enver Hoxha regime in Albania, so from this perspective, it could have been worse. It's also remarkable that the tribunal operated under post-Khmer Cambodian authority rather than the UN, which in itself is a very rare example of a country going through mad hell and crawling back to some semblance of self-governance that is strong enough to face its past and prosecute at least some of the guilty parties. Look, I don't want to laud the post-Khmer regime, but it needs to be said, given the circumstances where at some point the whole world, or at least the relevant parties, actively or passively supported the Khmer Rouge, even after 1979, the outcome is really not that bad. And the comparison has to be made with similar situations, like Bosnia or Rwanda. Hopefully, we will cover Bosnia in 2026. But if you look at how Rwanda developed after 1994, Cambodia is light years ahead, dysfunctional random notwithstanding. And while putting people like Comrade Dulc, who ran this horrific gulag, to trial may not have caused national healing, it sure did help. In an ironic twist of fate, these days Vietnam is more US aligned than ever, and Cambodia's geopolitics is more mixed than ever, which is exactly the opposite of what those who fought and died in the 1970s were hoping for, both Khmer and Vietnamese. It is also better than Mr. Kissinger, Zemlé Betonom, could have hoped as well, given that it was him who insisted that everyone passively support the Khmer Rouge just so no credence is given to the Vietnamese for ending the contemptible Pol Pot era. But that is a story for another day. Until then, in the next episode we'll look at the role of religion in general and of Buddhism in particular in both Cambodia and Laos. Contemporary Cambodia is officially a Buddhist state, one of the 4 alongside Myanmar, Sri Lanka and Bhutan. Laos, meanwhile, is a communist country, allegedly. But as shown in episodes 2 and 3, it's a lot more complicated than that. With a Buddhist flag and temples maintained by the communist state, Buddhism plays a major role in a country that is theoretically secular and communist. All of that and much more in the next episode. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you really like this kind of content, please do consider becoming a member. It's how these efforts are supported. Currently, we're trying to reach Tajikistan. And with that, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.